Today, basketball is a globally recognized sport that is heavily dominated by Black players. But there is a time that is not that long ago where Black players were excluded from the game. So to rectify this, they created their own all-Black basketball teams. So join us today while we talk about the history of the Black Five. And if you like stories like this, you can find more stories like this at onemichistory.com. Also, if you like audio-only episodes, you can find them wherever you get your podcasts. But without further ado, let's get started. Basketball is now an international sport, but it has its roots in 1891 with James Naismith, a Canadian-American physical education teacher. Designed to keep his students active during the winter, the game initially used a soccer ball and 2 peach baskets. Naismith created the game with 13 basic rules, forming a solid structural framework that still influences the game today. His efforts led to basketball inclusion as an organized sport in the 1936 Olympic Games and set the stage for the formation of the National Basketball Association in 1949. However, for Black players, especially in the early 20th century, basketball, much like the broader American society, was heavily racially segregated. White players predominantly occupied the professional scene, and despite immense talent, African American players faced systemic barriers and were excluded from the major leagues. In response to this, Black communities could create their own spaces. They embraced basketball as a means to foster social cohesion and enhance community pride and establish their own distinct identity. This movement was significantly influenced by a man by the name of Edwin Henderson, known as the godfather of Black basketball. In 1904, Henderson introduced basketball to African Americans in Washington, D.C. through segregated public school physical education classes. Following his studies at Harvard University, he saw the sport as a means to improve public health and advance civil rights by challenging stereotypes that Black people were inferior. This laid the initial foundation for the Black Five era that expanded from around 1904 into the 1950s. In those early days, basketball was not immediately popular with African Americans. They regarded it as a sissy game. But Henderson's efforts would pay off, and by 1906, he had founded an interscholastic athletic association of the Mid-Atlantic states to promote competition and intercollegiate and interscholastic athletes. This led to the formation of several all-Black basketball teams in New York City and Washington, D.C., which would become the early centers of Black basketball. The first independent Black basketball team was the Smart Set Athletic Club of Brooklyn. Established in 1907, this team won the first colored basketball world championship in 1907-1908 season. The first intercity competition between Black teams would take place in December of 1908 between the Smart Set Athletic Club and the Crescent Athletic Club of Washington, D.C., with the Brooklyn team emerging victorious. In the fall of 1910, Major A. Hart, a former manager of the St. Christopher Club, launched the New York All-Stars, the first all-Black professional basketball team. Hart saw basketball as both entertainment and a revenue opportunity, emphasizing fair, fast, clean play to popularize the sport amongst Black people. By the 1912-1913 season, inner city competition was thriving in the Black community, and teams from Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, and New York frequently competed alongside college teams Howard, Hampton, and Lincoln. This network soon expanded to the Midwest, and teams often had ties to local churches and athletic clubs and businesses and papers and YMCA branches, relying on community support for funding essentials like equipment, uniforms, and travel. This era laid the groundwork for the sport's expansion into the 1920s. So by 1923, Robert Douglas would establish the New York Renaissance, known as the Rens. The team was named after the Renaissance Casino and Ballroom in Harlem, where they played their inaugural game November of 1923 against an all-white team, the Collegiate Five. This venue, owned by the Sarko Realty Company and William Roach, allowed its dance floor to double as a basketball court. And despite not having an ideal site for basketball, the Wrens adapted the small, slippery floor, which was decorated with chandeliers and a bandstand, to 4 And following games, as well as at halftime, patrons would enjoy performances by bands like Duke Ellington and Ella Fitzgerald. Basketball games at this time served as one segment of the evening's entertainment, and this prompted Black Five-era teams to cultivate a faster, engaging, more entertaining style of play than their white counterparts. However, by the time of the Great Depression, dance halls would fall out of favor, and by 1928, the Wrens were traveling to the Northeast, reaching the Midwest by the 1930s, later barnstorming across the South. By 1931, they had formed an exceptional team called the Magnificent Seven, and from 1932 to 1936, they established an impressive record of 495 to 58, including an 88-game winning streak in 1933. Yet, their success came with several challenges. The Wrens often traveled for months, covering thousands of miles, playing nightly, sometimes twice on Sundays. They often had to sleep in their bus due to local segregation laws. They also faced biased refereeing and hostile crowds. They had a strategy called the Get Up 10, which would account for the number of points that the biased refs would cost them on that night. Yet the Wrens would continue to dominate the court, but they weren't the only Black Five team. There was the Washington Bears, another significant team led by founder and coach Ed Gottlieb, who also was the co-founder of the Basketball Association of America, which is the predecessor to the NBA, and Gottlieb also coached the original Philadelphia Warriors, which would later become the Golden State Warriors. The Bears were known for their skill and competitive spirit, and they frequently triumphed over white-dominated teams, forcing audience and critics alike to acknowledge the skill and ability of Black basketball players. Similarly, the Globetrotters, founded in 1926 by Abe Saperstein, gained fame for their unique blend of athleticism and entertainment. Their performances included competitive games mixed with comedy and trick shots, establishing them as international ambassadors for basketball and helping challenge racial stereotypes. They were so popular that in the 1940s, the Harlem Globetrotters often staged double headers with the Basketball Association of America to help keep the league afloat. Yet despite this, they faced numerous challenges and issues. First, financial issues were an almost constant burden. Teams relied heavily on community donations to cover essential costs like equipment, uniforms, and travel, and venue rentals. Sponsorship opportunities were scarce, leading to financial instability that sometimes resulted in teams simply disbanding overnight. For instance, the Low-End Big Five lost their sponsorship because they couldn't secure enough big game dates to sustain their expenses. Moreover, these teams played in adverse conditions, contending with hostile crowds and biased refs, especially during away games. They frequently endured racial slurs and name-calling. The travel was fraught with the risk of racial violence. Sometimes the Black Five teams had to compete against white teams under altered rules with biased officiating, and ironically, many teams would prefer white officials to Black referees due to skepticism about impartiality. Additionally, finding sustainable venues was a constant struggle. Some teams even had to play on rooftops exposed to the weather and the elements. Conflicts with amateur and professionalism further complicated the situation as the need to win clashed with the necessity of compensating their players. Additionally, Black teams received significantly less media coverage. Often that media coverage was negative compared to their white counterparts. Ultimately, the decline of the Black Five was because of changes in professional sports that were taking place during that time. By the 1940s, integration of basketball had signaled the end for Black Five teams. The National Basketball League merged with the Segregated Basketball Association of America to form the NBA in 1949, with the inclusion of Black players in the 1950s, with trailblazers like Bill Russell and Wilt Chamberlain coming soon after, paving the way for future generations. The financial struggles and limited resources of Black Five teams, combined with diminished interest as more Black players joined the NBA, led to these teams' continued decline. In the end, the New York Reds compiled an impressive 2,318 and 381 record before the team would disband in 1949. Later, the 1933 version of the Wrens was recognized by being collectively named to the Basketball Hall of Fame in 1963. The Black Five era was a crucial yet often overlooked chapter in basketball history, reflecting the contributions Black teams had on early basketball. These teams emerged during a time of racial segregation when Black athletes were excluded from predominantly white leagues. The Black Five's independent basketball teams were instrumental in showcasing their talent and fostering the sport's growth, both in the Black community and in America as a whole. The legacy of the Black Five also extends beyond the on-court achievements, offering a source of inspiration and a catalyst for social change. Their success challenged racial barriers and paved the way for the integration of sports as a whole and affected the broader athletic community. In 2005, their contributions that these pioneering teams made were formally recognized by the United States Congress, highlighting their enduring influence on basketball and American society. Thank you. This has been One Mic Black History. I'm your host, Country Poor. If you like stories like this, you can find more stories like this at onemichistory.com. If you like audio-only episodes, you can find those anywhere you get your podcasts. I'd like to thank all my financial contributors. Without you, none of this could be possible. And peace.